up on the program today. The first sets of donations headed towards Tonga to provide humanitarian relief following the volcanic eruption and tsunami that hit the Pacific island nation. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken brings America's reassurance to Ukraine amidst growing tensions with Russia. Plus, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says no to a question about whether he will resign following his attendance of a party during the lockdown. A warm welcome to the program today. I'm Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. New pictures from the consulate of the Kingdom of Tonga are showing the extent of damage to the Pacific island nation. They show the country blanketed in a layer of volcanic ash, while in the coastal areas, waves have torn down trees and ripped buildings apart. At least 3 people have died in the disaster, one of them a British national. International phone links are reported to have been restored, but a severed undersea cable could take up to 4 weeks to fix, meaning Tonga remains largely cut off from the outside world, with little known about the scale of destruction. Now, the first sets of donations have been making their way to Tonga. That help is coming from around the world. One U.S. family-owned business is preparing to send water and other critical supplies. It's not the first time they're doing this. They've been doing it for 37 years. They've been shipping to Tonga. Now they're collecting donations at their Oakland warehouse ahead of the regularly scheduled vessel departure on Friday.
We haven't been able to get a hold of anyone in our staff. Obviously this cargo gets there, gets processed, and then released to the community there. So we haven't been able to get a hold of anyone in our staff there since Friday. So, and not only that, our workers, we all have family there still. Our staff is our family too. So it definitely hits close to home. I mean, we're all just trying to do it day by day and try not to be so sad about the whole situation, because without having contact, we really don't know what the direct need is. We've just been taking a lot of water because we know the water supply is going to be completely gone. There's no municipal water in Tonga. They depend on rainwater. And so I'm sure all the tanks are filled with debris and ash. And so if anything, anyone that calls to want to try to help, we just tell them water. That's what we could do right now.
A New Zealand vessels already left on Tuesday, bringing critical water and other supplies. The vessels are expected to arrive in Tonga on Friday. Captain of the vessel, the Aotearoa, says his ship is carrying 250,000 litres of water and had the capacity to produce another 70,000 litres a day, along with other supplies.
I mean, any time a Pacific nation has called on us for support, we have always said yes. And so, I'll be talking to the Prime Minister, I hope, later today, communications allowing, and we can run through whatever else they might need. But our Defence Forces have stood up their operation and are deploying as necessary and as directed. So.
I would apologise. That was the Australian Prime Minister, but we were talking about New Zealand. Also sending supplies to Australia is the naval vessel HMAS Adelaide, which arrived in Brisbane today to be loaded with supplies for Tonga. Pacific neighbour Fiji will also send defence engineers on the vessel, which leaves for Tonga on Friday.
I mean, any time a Pacific nation has called on us for support, we have always said yes. And so, I'll be talking to the Prime Minister, I hope, later today, communications allowing, and we can run through whatever else they might need. But our Defence Forces have stood up their operation and are deploying as necessary and as directed. So we feel deeply for our family in Tonga. It is a very difficult environment to be operating in, the ash clouds and things of that nature. I really feel it's a very small island community in Tonga, and there are a lot of Australians of Tongan descent and who have family and friends, and many Australians have visited there. So they would be expecting us to do everything we can to stand with our Pacific family in Tonga, and they're a faith-filled community and they're a beautiful community, and I'm sure they'll be supporting each other, but they need us now, and they're getting our help. Thank you.
China's ambassador to Tonga, Cao Zhaolin, says all citizens living and working in the mainland are safe. In an interview with a TV station, he described some of the damage caused, saying not only were communication lines down, roads were blocked, some houses of the smaller islands were engulfed by the tsunami, and specific casualties are still being counted. He says households are facing difficulties with their drinking water because ash is spewed everywhere, which is also affecting local air. However, social order is good in general, he says. Ambassador Cao has been able to contact 1,000 Chinese nationals known to be on Tonga Patu, which was hit by the devastating tsunami triggered by the volcanic eruption. Pope Francis has prayed for the people of Tonga. During his weekly general audience, he said, "My thought goes to the people of the island of Tonga, hit in the past few days by the eruption of the underwater volcano, causing enormous material damage. I'm particularly close to the people who are being so sorely tired, and I implore God to comfort them in their suffering. I invite everyone to join me in prayer for these brothers and sisters." Let's switch gears now. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken wants Russia to take on a diplomatic and peaceful path as fear mounts over a new invasion of Ukraine. An estimated 100,000 Russian troops have been deployed near Ukraine's borders. And Mr. Blinken, visiting Kiev, says Russia could launch an attack at very short notice.
The U.S. Secretary of State landed in Kiev today, seeking to defuse a crisis with Moscow over Ukraine. His trip comes amid concerns voiced by Ukraine and its Western allies over the tens of thousands of Russian troops amassed in and near Ukraine. During a press conference today, he said the U.S. was reaffirming its commitment to Ukraine.
The President asked me to come now to both reaffirm our own commitment to Ukraine, to consult closely with its leaders, as well tomorrow in Berlin to speak to many of our European colleagues, and then finally on Friday to see the Russian Foreign Minister, to take stock of where we are after a week of what's been very intense diplomacy between the United States and Russia at the NATO-Russia Council and at the OSCE.
We'll see you. Hello, nice to meet you.
So good to see you. How are you?
Mr. Blinken met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky later in the morning. He said that finding a diplomatic resolution to the conflict was a clear preference, but that Moscow would face serious consequences if it chooses to renew aggression. Zelensky thanked the U.S. top diplomat for increasing military assistance from the United States to Ukraine. In the meantime, allies have been aligning with Ukraine. Canada's Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, during her meeting with top officials in Kiev, criticized Russia's massing troops near the borders.
We need to make sure that the message is clear. Russia's military buildup around Ukraine is unacceptable. Russia is the aggressor, and we make sure to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine.
Britain's military aid arrived on Tuesday, including anti-tank weapons to help Kiev defend itself from a potential invasion. The Kremlin says tension around Ukraine is increasing with the weapons deliveries, military maneuvers, and NATO aircraft flights, something it says international partners should take into account. Moscow denies any plans for an attack, but says it could take unspecified military action unless the West agrees to a list of demands, including banning Ukraine from ever joining NATO. French President Emmanuel Macron wants the European Union to hold frank dialogue with Russia and seek a political solution to the tensions. He says France, together with Germany, wants to continue seeking a political response to the tensions over Ukraine.
The VOA's Henry Ridgewell has been monitoring events from London. Henry, great to see you. Russia continues to deny preparing an offensive against Ukraine, but its precedence has only helped to build this distrust the nations have of it. Is Russia really spoiling for war with Ukraine?
That is the big fear in European capitals and in Washington.
Russia has over 100,000 troops stationed to the north, to the east, and to the south of Ukraine. That includes as well military hardware, tanks, heavy weapons. And I think the overriding problem here is that European leaders fear that Russia has driven the rhetoric so high over Ukraine that it is now going to be very difficult for Moscow to back down from its position. Moscow has laid out a series of steps that it is demanding of NATO to promise never to allow Ukraine to join the alliance, to roll back some of NATO's deployments in Eastern European states like Poland and Estonia. And those are really demands that NATO would never agree to. And so where does Russia go from here? Can it find, and can the West offer Russia some kind of ramp down from this rhetorical, from this very hard position it's taking with NATO? Or will Russia continue down this path, which seemingly is leading to potential conflict in Ukraine? So that's the big fear at the moment. Back in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, the peninsula in southern Ukraine, it was a result of the ousting of the pro-Russian president in Ukraine. And the problem now is that Europe doesn't see a particular provocation that has brought Russia to this point. And that means there's no easy solution to it. So is Russia spoiling for war? The troops are in place, the military hardware is in place, the rhetoric coming from the Kremlin is certainly aggressive. We'll find out in the coming days and weeks, not least on Friday, when Antony Blinken meets his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Geneva, whether Russia is going to take steps further towards conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Well, the only one who seems to be speaking peace at the moment is French President Emmanuel Macron, who wants the EU to engage in frank dialogue with Russia and also to seek a political solution. Is he the only one, thinking like this?
There are many dynamics going on within this crisis. This is not just about Russia and the West. Number one, it's NATO is trying to present a united front on this as the main military alliance that is confronting Russia, but there are tensions within NATO itself. Russia wants to deal directly, bilaterally with the main powers, primarily with the United States, but also with the big European powers like France, like Germany, and Britain. Now, the French have all long been advocates of what the French president terms strategic sovereignty for the European Union. President Macron wants the European Union to be a much bigger player on the world stage. And so now that France has taken over the 6-month rotating presidency of the European Union, he's set out his position on that and wants Europe to play a far greater role. Of course, the problem is there's no European Union army. It doesn't have its own standing army or air force or anything like that. Its security really is underpinned still by NATO. So there are some contradictions there when President Macron says that Europe has to have this frank dialogue with Russia. There's another flaw in President Macron's plan in that over the past 2 years, he's tried to build a bilateral dialogue between France and Russia, a sort of grand power strategy to try to calm relations. But that didn't go down at all well with Eastern European states who felt they were being ignored by the French in their bilateral dialogue with Moscow. Now, add on another layer of resentment that many European countries, not least President Macron, but Brussels and the European Union itself, feels bypassed by the United States now that the United States and Russia are holding bilateral talks in Geneva. And you see that there are all sorts of tensions and contradictions within the Western position as well on Russia. And that's something that many people fear is playing into Russia's hands. Russia has developed an expert way of dividing and confusing and using misinformation, so analysts say, to try to divide the West. And that seems to be playing out at the moment. Meanwhile, you have Western leaders, and particularly NATO, desperate to try to present a united front to Moscow to say, look, if you invade Ukraine, there are going to be desperately harsh consequences for you.
Indeed, Henry, and Russia in the end playing its card, holding its card close to its chest. We'll have to wait till Friday for that meeting between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Russian counterparts. Thank you again, Henry.
Good to be with you, Amarachi.
We have more stories coming up on The World Today. Plus, tradition continues in Ivanovo village in Russia with a dip in ice-cold waters, marking the start of the Feast of Epiphany. Once again. Welcome back. We're in the UK. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson fighting to save his premiership amid a storm over a series of lockdown parties in Downing Street. Told Parliament today he will not resign. Mr. Johnson is struggling to quell an internal revolt by his own lawmakers who are angry over the parties in Downing Street. The Prime Minister's office and residence during the lockdowns, as well as facing opposition calls for him to step down. Johnson, who in 2019 won his party's biggest majority in more than 30 years on a pledge to get Brexit done, has repeatedly apologized for the parties and said he was unaware of many of them. However, he attended what he said he thought was a work event on May 20, 2020, when the UK had been under lockdown. Well, Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition Labour Party, asked Johnson in the Prime Minister's questions session in Parliament today if Mr. Johnson should resign if he misled Parliament.
No, Mr. Speaker, but what I can tell her is that, as I said to the House last week, I apologise sincerely for any misjudgments that were made, but she must contain her impatience, Mr. Speaker, and wait for the inquiry next week before she draws any of the conclusions that she's just asserted.
Mr. Speaker, first he said there were no parties. Then the video landed, blowing that defence out the water. Next, he said he was sicker than furious when he found out about the parties, until it turned out that he himself was at the Downing Street garden party. Then last week he said he didn't realise he was at a party, and surprise, surprise, no one believed him. So this week, he's got a new defence. Nobody warned me that it was against the rules. That's it. Nobody told him. Since the Prime Minister wrote the rules, why on earth does he think that his new defence is going to work for him?
Speaker, like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months...
One of the voices in Parliament today was a senior Conservative lawmaker and former minister. David Davids told the Prime Minister he should resign.
Many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things. But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Another lawmaker, Christian Wakeford, quit Boris Johnson's Conservative Party to join the opposition, describing the Prime Minister's behaviour over lockdown parties as disgraceful and fueling a rebellion against his premiership. Wakeford, who represents the Bury South constituency in North England, said in a statement that Johnson's policies were doing nothing to help the people he represents and that he was joining the main opposition Labour Party. A Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, warmly welcomed Wakeford to the party during the parliamentary session.
Can I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves, whereas the Labour Party stands ready to provide an alternative government that the country can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has changed, and so has the Conservative Party. He and anyone else who wants to build a new Britain built on decency, security, prosperity and respect is welcome in my Labour Party.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, he talks about and as for Bury South, Mr. Speaker, as for Bury South, let me say to the right gentleman, Mr. Speaker, by all leave, may I say to the right honourable gentleman that the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election under this Prime Minister.
We're not quite out of the British Parliament. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson today announced the relaxing of COVID restrictions across the country. There's more in the Global Update.
We now come to the COVID-19 statements.
Betting Omicron cases have peaked. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced the end of COVID-19 measures introduced to curb the rapid spread of the variant in England.
As a result, from the start of Thursday next week, mandatory certification will end. Organisations can, of course, choose to use the NHS COVID pass voluntarily, but we will end the compulsory use of COVID status certification in England. From now on, the government is no longer asking people to work from home. And people should now speak to their employers about arrangements for returning to the office. And having looked at the data carefully, the Cabinet concluded that once regulations lapse, the government will no longer mandate the wearing of face masks anywhere.
Britain was the first country to limit international travel over the Omicron variant, raising alarm bells about its mutations, and in December introduced work-at-home advice, more mask wearing and vaccine passes to slow its spread. Austria's new daily coronavirus infections have shattered the previous record as the extremely contagious Omicron variant continues to spread. The previous record for new daily cases published by the Interior and Health Ministries was at 17,006, set a week ago. Despite having set a new record, the Prime Minister assures people that the cause of the spread is following predictions. France registered 464,769 new COVID-19 infections over the previous 24 hours, the highest ever recorded tally since the start of the pandemic. The high numbers are explained by the Omicron variant's rapid spread. Scientific data shows a lower risk of severe disease from Omicron compared to the Delta variant. The number of people in intensive care units slightly decreased in the same period to around 3,900. Japan has widened COVID-19 curbs to the capital Tokyo and a dozen regions, covering half the population, as the Omicron variant of coronavirus drove record new infections. Already in effect in 3 regions, the measures are set to run from Friday until February the 13th. The quasi-emergency measures permit governors to limit mobility and business activities by shortening the operating hours of bars and restaurants and barring sales of alcohol. China has reported the lowest daily count of local confirmed COVID-19 infections in 2 weeks after cities sealed up areas of virus risk, quarantined infections, and conducted mass testing. Mainland China reported a total of 55 domestically transmitted infections, with confirmed symptoms lower than 127 a day earlier and marking the fewest since January the 4th. And finally, Hong Kong health workers are carrying out a mass cull of hamsters over COVID-19 fears after tracing the coronavirus outbreak to a worker in the Little Boss pet shop, where 11 hamsters subsequently tested positive for COVID-19. Scientists around the world have said there's no evidence that animals play a major role in human contagion with the coronavirus. But having pursued a policy of zero tolerance for COVID-19, Health Secretary Sophia Chan said on Tuesday could not rule out any transmission possibilities, and therefore the government could take no chances.
We're ending the world today on a really icy note as Russians brave the cold waters in Ivanovo village in Moscow to mark the feast of the Russian Orthodox Epiphany. The age-old ritual commemorates the baptism of Jesus Christ in the Jordan River, or the Epiphany, which the Russian Orthodox Church celebrates in the middle of the Russian winter. A former military who's been plunging into an ice hole for the last 15 years says he considers the Epiphany celebration sacred for every Russian. Worshippers believe their sins are symbolically washed away through the ritual. It's also thought to bring good luck in some parts of the world. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.